orange.
Just enjoying coffee and breakfast, even though it's like 1 p.m.
Literally, we sleep in.
The call did not sound like a celebrity emergency. It sounded like panic. A voice on the other end of the line described a man acting erratically inside a hotel room in Buenos Aires. Unstable, disoriented, possibly under the influence, possibly in danger. Minutes later, that man was dead. To the world, he was Liam Payne, a global pop star, a former member of One Direction, a voice that once filled stadiums and teenage bedrooms across continents. But in those final hours, he was alone in a hotel room surrounded not by fans, but by unanswered decisions, delayed reactions, and a chain of moments that now feel impossible to ignore. Why was he left in that room when warning signs were already there? Who knew how bad his condition really was and when? What happened between the emergency call and the moment his body fell from the balcony? This is not a story about fame. It is a story about the fragile space between crisis and catastrophe, about how quickly things can slip beyond control when the system around a vulnerable person fails to slow down. Tonight, we are going to rewind time. We will move through Liam Payne's final hours minute by minute, room by room. We will look at what is known, what is disputed, and what still does not add up. And only then will we ask the question that continues to haunt fans and investigators alike. What really happened in Liam Payne's final hours? The news broke quietly at first, then all at once. A short alert appeared on phones. A headline flickered across screens in different languages. Within minutes, social media timelines began to fill with the same sentence, repeated in disbelief. Then, in grief, Liam Payne was dead. At first, many fans refused to believe it. Celebrity death hoaxes were nothing new, and Liam was only in his early 30s. He had been posting, traveling, making appearances. He was supposed to be in recovery, rebuilding, moving forward. This was not how the story was meant to end. But confirmation followed quickly. Local authorities in Argentina confirmed a fatal fall from a hotel balcony in Buenos Aires. Emergency services were dispatched. The scene was sealed. And suddenly, the world was forced to confront an impossible contrast. A global pop icon, lifeless on the pavement below a hotel room. Within hours, international media outlets picked up the story. News anchors spoke in hushed tones. Entertainment journalists scrambled to reconstruct his last known movements. Former bandmates released short, stunned statements. Fans gathered online, refreshing pages, searching for clarity in a storm of partial information. The shock was not just that Liam Payne had died. It was how. A fall. A hotel room. A sudden, violent ending that raised more questions than it answered. Almost immediately, the narrative fractured into competing versions. Some reports described erratic behavior in the hours before his death. Others focused on the emergency call that suggested he was already in crisis before the fall. There were whispers of substances, of mental health struggles, of people nearby who may have underestimated the danger. And then there was the room itself. Photos and descriptions began to circulate: furniture disturbed, signs of chaos, the suggestion of a space that had become unmanageable long before the final moment. To many, it no longer looked like an accident that came out of nowhere. It looked like a situation spiraling out of control. For fans who had grown up with Liam's voice as a soundtrack to adolescence, the reaction was visceral. Vigils appeared outside hotels, record stores, and concert venues around the world. Candles flickered beneath posters of a smiling young man frozen in time. Messages flooded comment sections, many asking the same question in different words. How did it get this bad? To understand why Liam's death hit with such force, you have to understand what he represented. He was not just a singer, he was a symbol of an era. One Direction had been one of the most powerful pop phenomena of the 21st century. Their rise was meteoric, almost unreal. 5 young men pulled from obscurity into global stardom, performing for screaming crowds night after night, city after city, without pause. For years, Liam was seen as the steady one, the responsible one, the voice of reason inside the group. He often spoke about structure, discipline, and holding things together behind the scenes. While others were labeled the heartthrob or the rebel, Liam became the anchor. But anchors can sink too. As the band went on hiatus and each member stepped into solo life, the pressure did not disappear. It changed shape. The constant spotlight remained, but now it was focused on individual success or failure. Comparisons became unavoidable. Silence became louder than applause. Over time, cracks began to show. Interviews grew heavier. Public appearances became more unpredictable. Liam spoke openly about struggling with alcohol, about losing control, about not recognizing himself during certain periods of his life. He talked about fame arriving too fast, about never having the chance to grow up outside of the machine. These were not confessions made in secret. They were warnings offered in plain sight. And yet, when the final news came from Buenos Aires, it still felt sudden, because somewhere along the way, the world had grown used to watching celebrities suffer without truly seeing how close some of them are to the edge. In the days following Liam's death, attention shifted from shock to scrutiny. Journalists began asking harder questions. Authorities confirmed that an emergency call had been placed before the fatal fall. The caller reportedly described a guest who was not in control of his actions, who may have been under the influence, who posed a risk to himself. That detail changed everything. It meant Liam's death was not just a tragic moment. It was the end point of a crisis already unfolding. Why, then, was he still alone in that room? Why was he allowed to return to a space with access to a balcony? Who made the call? And what exactly did they communicate to emergency services? The case was no longer just about what happened in a single second. It was about what happened in the hours before. To find those answers, we need to rewind further, not just to the final night in Buenos Aires, but to the life that led him there, to the boy who became famous before he became fully formed, to the success that arrived faster than stability, to the long descent that unfolded far from the screaming crowds. Because the truth about Liam Payne's final hours does not begin in that hotel room. It begins years earlier, when the lights first turned on and never really turned off. Long before the hotel room in Buenos Aires, before the emergency call, before the fall, there was a boy from Wolverhampton who simply wanted to sing. Liam Payne grew up in a working-class family in the English Midlands, far removed from the glamour that would later define his public image. As a child, he struggled with health issues and bullying. Music became both refuge and ambition, a way to be seen and a way to escape. Those early years shaped something important in him. A deep desire to prove his worth, to be dependable, to succeed not just for himself, but for the people around him. That drive carried him to the X Factor not once, but twice. The first rejection stung deeply. The second audition, years later, changed everything. When One Direction was formed, success arrived at a velocity few humans are equipped to handle. Within months, Liam and 4 other teenagers were transformed into a global brand. Albums, tours, interviews, airports, hotel rooms, screaming fans, the cycle never stopped. Childhood ended overnight. Inside the group, Liam was often described as the responsible one. He helped organize vocals, kept schedules in check, tried to maintain discipline in an environment that rewarded chaos. That role earned him respect, but it also placed weight on his shoulders that few noticed. By the time One Direction announced their hiatus, the world saw 5 young men stepping into freedom. What it did not see was how disorienting that freedom could be. Without the structure of the group, Liam entered a new phase of his life where identity became fragile. Solo success was no longer shared. Every chart position, every headline, every criticism now pointed directly at him. The safety net was gone. Publicly, he smiled. Privately, he struggled. In interviews years later, Liam would admit that there were periods he barely remembered, years blurred by alcohol, emotional numbness, and a growing sense of emptiness. He spoke about waking up in unfamiliar places, about losing control, about feeling trapped inside the persona he was expected to maintain. Fame had not abandoned him. But meaning had begun to erode. As solo releases came and went, the pressure intensified. The industry demanded reinvention, relevance, constant visibility. Social media magnified every misstep. A single clip, a single comment, could spiral into days of backlash. Liam's relationships became public property. His struggles became content. His attempts at honesty were often met with ridicule instead of support. Behind the scenes, the signs of collapse were becoming harder to ignore. There were reports of canceled appearances, erratic behavior, moments where those close to him grew concerned. Liam himself began speaking more openly about addiction and mental health, not as abstract topics, but as lived experiences. He described drinking to cope with anxiety. He described feeling lost without a sense of direction. He described how success had arrived before he had the tools to survive it. These were not isolated comments. They formed a pattern of someone trying to claw his way back from the edge while still being pushed forward by an industry that rarely slows down for vulnerability. By the early 2020s, Liam attempted to reset. He spoke about sobriety, about therapy, about becoming a father and wanting to be better. There were moments of hope, moments where it seemed the descent had stopped. But recovery is not a straight line. And for someone whose entire adult life unfolded under constant observation, every setback felt amplified. Shame became public, relapse became rumor, silence became speculation. As time went on, the contrast grew sharper. On one side, the memory of stadiums, applause, global success. On the other, quiet rooms, long nights, and a mind that would not slow down. By the time Liam boarded a flight to Argentina, he was not at his peak. He was in transition, trying to hold on, trying to move forward, trying once again to regain control. What no one could know yet was that this journey would end not with a comeback, but with a final room, a final night, and a series of decisions that would prove irreversible. Because the collapse does not happen in one moment. It happens slowly, until, suddenly, there is no way back. By the time Liam Payne reached his 30s, the cracks were no longer subtle. They were visible, audible, and increasingly difficult to contain. From the outside, his life still looked enviable. Fame, money, recognition, the things millions chase and never reach. But inside, something had shifted. The structure that once protected him had vanished, replaced by an unforgiving cycle of expectations and self-doubt. Liam began to speak openly about alcohol in a way that felt less like confession and more like warning. He described drinking not for pleasure, but to quiet his mind, to sleep, to escape the constant noise of being watched, judged, compared. He admitted that there were stretches of time he could barely remember, entire chapters of his life dissolved in haze. What made these admissions unsettling was their honesty. He was not glamorizing collapse. He was documenting it. At the same time, public perception grew harsher. Social media amplified every misstep. A poorly received interview, a comment taken out of context, a performance scrutinized frame by frame. The internet, once a place of adoration, became a courtroom without rules. Liam's attempts to explain himself often backfired. Vulnerability was interpreted as weakness. Accountability was framed as instability. The more he tried to clarify who he was becoming, the more fragmented the image grew. Relationships added another layer of strain. Romantic partners came and went under the glare of tabloids. Personal conflicts became public debates. Even moments meant to be private, fatherhood, recovery, reflection, were dissected online. Behind the scenes, concern grew among those close to him. There were reports of missed obligations, of mood swings, of periods where communication broke down. While no single incident defined his descent, the accumulation told a clear story. Liam was struggling to stay grounded in a world that never stopped spinning. Mental health professionals often describe crisis as a convergence when stressors stack without relief. For Liam, that convergence included fame without pause, identity without stability, and a history of coping mechanisms that no longer worked. The industry did what it often does in these moments. It waited. There were attempts at rebranding, talk of new music, hints of a comeback, public statements about sobriety and growth. Each announcement carried hope and pressure. The message was clear. Recovery was acceptable, as long as it led quickly back to productivity. But healing does not follow press cycles. As months passed, Liam's public appearances became less frequent, then more unpredictable. When he did speak, there was a rawness that unsettled audiences accustomed to polished pop stars. He no longer sounded like someone selling resilience. He sounded like someone asking for it. And still, the machine kept moving. Travel continued. Commitments remained. The world expected progress, not pause. In retrospect, the warning signs feel unmistakable. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were consistent. A man oscillating between control and collapse, between accountability and overwhelm, between wanting to disappear and needing to be seen. By the time he arrived in Buenos Aires, Liam was carrying more than luggage. He was carrying years of unresolved pressure, exhaustion, and fragile balance. Those close to him later described him as vulnerable in that period. Not necessarily suicidal, but unstable, emotionally raw, prone to impulsive decisions. A person who should not have been left alone during moments of distress. That distinction matters, because what happened next was not the result of a single breakdown, but the final rupture in a system already stretched to its limit. The tragedy of Liam Payne is not that he struggled. It is that his struggle was visible, and still, the momentum never stopped. And as the calendar moved closer to his final night, the margin for error narrowed to nothing. In the next part of this story, we return to the timeline, to the final trip, to the days and then hours when concern turned into crisis. Because once Liam checked into that hotel, the clock had already started counting down. In the weeks leading up to his death, Liam Payne's life moved quietly but uneasily. There was no grand announcement, no triumphant return to the spotlight. Instead, there were small signals, scattered across interviews, social media activity, and conversations with people around him. Signals that, in hindsight, feel less like updates and more like warnings. Those close to Liam later described him as emotionally fragile during this period. Not withdrawn, not absent but volatile, capable of warmth and humor one moment, then slipping into agitation or despair the next. It was as if he were constantly fighting to stay present, to keep control of himself in a world that no longer offered guardrails. Travel became a coping mechanism. Movement, distraction, distance. Argentina was not supposed to be an ending. It was meant to be a pause, a change of environment, a chance to reset. But for someone already unsteady, constant displacement can deepen instability rather than relieve it. In the days before the fatal night, reports suggest that Liam's behavior had begun to alarm people around him. He appeared restless. His mood shifted quickly. There were moments when he seemed overwhelmed by his surroundings, reacting disproportionately to minor stressors. Still, life continued. Hotel staff saw him as just another famous guest, difficult perhaps, unpredictable at times, but not unusual in a city accustomed to celebrities. Friends and associates nearby may have noticed the tension, but crisis does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides behind familiarity. What makes this period so haunting is not what we know, but what we almost know. There were conversations that felt unfinished, plans that were vague, commitments that remained open-ended. Liam had spoken before about wanting stability, about slowing down, about being better. Yet the environment around him still demanded movement. As the final days approached, isolation began to take shape. Hotel rooms are designed to be anonymous, temporary, interchangeable. For someone in distress, they can feel like sealed boxes, places where time blurs and emotions echo without interruption. On the last day of his life, witnesses would later describe Liam as visibly unsettled. He was not hiding his discomfort. He was not pretending everything was fine. He was, in many ways, signaling distress through agitation, through loss of control, through behavior that drew attention. At some point, concern escalated enough that emergency services were contacted. This is a crucial moment in the story, because once that call was made, Liam's condition was no longer a private matter. It had crossed into official awareness. Someone, somewhere, believed he was at risk. And yet, despite that acknowledgement, the situation did not resolve. There was no hospital admission, no enforced supervision, no removal from the environment that would soon become fatal. Instead, the day continued. Liam returned to his room. The balcony door remained accessible. The variables remained unchanged. This is where the story shifts from tragedy to investigation. Because many people struggle. Many people relapse. Many people behave erratically under stress. But not all of them die. What separates those who survive from those who don't is often intervention timing, judgment, proximity. In Liam Payne's case, the final days raise a question that refuses to fade. If the danger was visible before the fall, why did the system around him fail to slow things down? As night fell over Buenos Aires, the city moved on. Traffic hummed. Somewhere above the street, in a hotel room that now carried the weight of everything that came before, Liam Payne was approaching the end of his journey. The final 24 hours had begun. The final 24 hours of Liam Payne's life unfolded without ceremony. There was no dramatic countdown, no obvious marker that this would be the last day. Buenos Aires woke, as it always did, traffic, voices, sunlight filtering through hotel windows. Somewhere above the street, in a room several floors up, Liam Payne was still alive. What is known about those hours comes in fragments. From witness statements, from official reports, from the emergency call that would later become central to the investigation. There are gaps, moments that remain unclear, and it is within those gaps that the most difficult questions reside. According to reports, Liam had been inside his hotel room for much of the day. His behavior was described as erratic and increasingly unstable. He appeared disoriented, agitated, at times unable to regulate his emotions or actions. People around him noticed. This was not subtle distress. It was visible enough to prompt concern. At some point, that concern escalated. An emergency call was placed to local authorities. The caller reportedly described a guest who was not in control of himself, who might be under the influence of substances, and who posed a risk possibly to himself. The language used in that call matters, because it suggests that Liam's condition was already recognized as dangerous before the fatal fall. This is one of the most haunting elements of the case. Because once a situation is identified as a risk, the question becomes not what happened, but what was done. Reports indicate that emergency responders were aware of the situation. And yet, Liam was not taken to a hospital. He was not placed under observation. He was allowed to remain in the same environment where his instability had already been observed. Instead, he was returned to his room. The room with the balcony. The room where isolation could deepen, where agitation could escalate without interruption. As evening approached, the atmosphere inside that space reportedly grew more chaotic. Descriptions of the room later suggested disorder, furniture disturbed, signs of a struggle not with another person, but with one's own state of mind. It was not the scene of a celebration. It was the scene of a person losing control. What happened next unfolded quickly. At some point during the night, Liam fell from the hotel balcony. Whether he lost his balance, acted impulsively, or was overcome by a moment of disorientation remains a matter of investigation. Authorities would later state that there was no evidence of third-party involvement. The injuries were consistent with a fall from height. But absence of foul play does not mean absence of responsibility. Emergency services arrived. The scene was secured. Liam Payne was pronounced dead at the scene. He was 31 years old. In the immediate aftermath, confusion spread. Staff, witnesses, and responders struggled to process what had just occurred. A global star had died in a place designed for temporary stays, a space that would soon be emptied, cleaned, and reused, while questions lingered outside its walls. As details emerged, one fact stood out above all others. This was not a sudden, invisible crisis. It was a visible descent that culminated in a moment no one managed to stop. The final image is a painful one to hold, not of a balcony or a fall, but of time, of hours passing, of warning signs acknowledged, then set aside, of a system that recognized danger yet failed to create safety. In the end, Liam Payne did not die in a studio or on a stage or surrounded by the noise of fame. He died alone, in a quiet moment that followed a very loud cry for help. And once the shock faded, a new phase began. The aftermath, the investigation, the arguments over what should have happened and who, if anyone, will be held accountable. Because for many, the story did not end when Liam fell. That was only the beginning of the questions. In the hours after Liam Payne's death, the focus shifted from grief to procedure. Police sealed off the area below the hotel balcony. Statements were taken. Surveillance footage was reviewed. Medical examiners began their work. Almost immediately, authorities stated that there were no signs of third-party involvement, no evidence that anyone had pushed him, no indication of a physical altercation with another person. The preliminary conclusion was blunt: a fatal fall. But for many, that explanation felt incomplete, because what troubled people was not only how Liam died but everything that happened before he did. Details from the emergency call began to surface in the press. The caller's description suggested that Liam was already in a state of crisis prior to the fall. Words like "out of control" and "danger to himself" appeared in reporting. This transformed public understanding of the case. If he was known to be at risk, then why was he not protected? This question quickly became the center of debate. Legal experts weighed in on responsibility. Some argued that once authorities were notified, protocols should have required stronger intervention, medical evaluation, supervision, or temporary confinement for his own safety. Others countered that unless a person explicitly expresses suicidal intent, the threshold for involuntary hospitalization can be legally complex. Hotel policies were scrutinized. What training did staff have to recognize and respond to mental health emergencies? Who decided that Liam could return to his room? Were safety measures considered, or was the situation treated as another instance of difficult celebrity behavior? As the investigation continued, reports emerged of potential substance involvement. Toxicology results were discussed cautiously in the media, often without full context. Some outlets rushed to conclusions, framing the tragedy as inevitable the result of addiction alone. That framing angered many fans, because it felt reductive, and because it ignored the chain of decisions that unfolded around him. Family representatives urged restraint, emphasizing that speculation only deepened the pain. They called for compassion, not just for Liam, but for anyone struggling with mental health under public scrutiny. Online, the debate grew louder. Some saw Liam as a victim of an industry that failed him from the beginning, a child star pushed too fast, too hard, with too little protection. Others argued that adults must be responsible for their own actions, regardless of fame or circumstance. Between those extremes lay a quieter, more uncomfortable truth. Multiple things can be true at once. Liam may have been responsible for some of his choices. He may also have been profoundly unwell, and the system around him may have recognized danger without acting decisively enough to prevent disaster. As days passed, legal outcomes remained uncertain. No criminal charges were immediately filed. The case, at least officially, moved toward closure. But culturally, it remained wide open. Because cases like this rarely resolve neatly, they linger in the public imagination as cautionary tales, not because of what is proven in court, but because of what feels unresolved in conscience. The haunting part of Liam Payne's story is not the fall itself. It is the idea that the fall may have been preventable. That one different decision, a hospital stay, a locked balcony door, someone staying with him, might have changed everything. Instead, the world was left with a familiar pattern: shock, debate, gradual silence, and a name added to a growing list of famous lives that ended not in spectacle but in isolation. Which brings us to the final question. When the noise fades, when investigations conclude, and when headlines move on, what remains? What does Liam Payne leave behind? And what are we meant to learn from the way his story ended? When the headlines moved on, what remained was silence. The hotel room in Buenos Aires was emptied. The balcony stood unchanged. The street below returned to its normal rhythm. As with so many tragedies before it, the physical space of Liam Payne's final hours began to erase itself, while the emotional aftermath refused to disappear. Liam left behind more than chart positions or fan statistics. He left behind a generation that grew up with his voice woven into their most formative years. Songs that once represented joy, youth, and possibility now carried a different weight, one shaped by loss. For many fans, revisiting One Direction's music became complicated. The melodies were the same, but the knowledge had changed. Behind every harmony now lived the awareness of how fragile those young men truly were when fame arrived too fast and stayed too long. Liam's legacy is not just musical. It is human. He became one of the most visible examples of what happens when global success collides with unresolved vulnerability. When applause replaces stability. When recovery is expected to happen on schedule. When warning signs are acknowledged but not fully acted upon. His story forces an uncomfortable reckoning about how society treats celebrities who struggle, about how mental health crises are often minimized until they become fatal, about how systems designed to manage people, hotels, security, emergency services, the entertainment industry, are rarely designed to protect them when the danger is internal. Liam was not a cautionary tale because he fell. He was a cautionary tale because so many opportunities existed to stop the fall, and none were fully taken. In the end, his final hours reveal something painfully universal. That the most dangerous moments are not always loud. They unfold quietly, behind closed doors, in spaces where help is nearby but not close enough. Liam Payne's life ended far from a stage, far from a microphone, far from the crowds that once defined him. It ended in a room meant to be temporary, a reminder of how isolating crisis can be, even for someone known by millions. What we choose to do with that knowledge matters, because his story is not just about one man. It is about how we respond when vulnerability becomes visible, about whether we slow down or keep moving until it's too late. And if there is one final lesson hidden inside those last hours, it may be this. Fame can amplify everything: success, pressure, pain, but it cannot replace care. And without care, even the brightest lives can fade quietly, before anyone realizes they are truly in danger. Liam Payne is gone, but the questions his final hours raised are still here.